And in fact, what happened was, across a wide diversity of communities, low income, middle income, upper middle income, Kansas City, Missouri, Chattanooga, Tennessee, Portland, Oregon, we got pretty much, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, pretty much the same results, which is about half the people whose doors were knocked on by their neighbor, which, by the way, was a revelatory moment to meet your neighbor, actually. And think about what you would do if your door was knocked on by your neighbor and those three things were asked of you, or were shared with you, and you were invited to this home. Part of what we found was that people wanted to know what their neighbor's house looked like. Part of what they wanted to know was who else was going to be there. There was just not an opportunity like this. So when you brought all those things together, we found that most of the people were saying yes, half actually came, and 75% joined. We were getting a 25% recruitment rate across the entire country, which for us was like a miracle. And pretty consistently. And we could teach people how to deliver this message, and it was a very simple, understandable script, and we would train people to say it, and then they would keep track and do all logistics. So it was quite exciting. We then began looking at how to diffuse this. We took on a number of partners. One of them was the President's Council on Sustainable Development, who was looking for a tool, and they helped us grow this across many cities in the country. We began to work with state environmental agencies who had reached the limit of 1.0 laws and regulations and tax policy, and we're saying, how do we actually get this 2.0 idea? How do we get behavior change to work? And they began to diffuse it among different cities. So at the end of the day, this was the tipping point we hit. In many, many communities, we got to full diffusion on the block, well into the late majority. In many neighborhoods, we got well into the late majority of blocks. We also discovered that when you're diffusing an innovation like this, there's not just the sort of starting point innovation. The second one was we went to 25 cities. We did this in 25 US cities and about a couple of hundred cities in Europe, with about 250,000 people participating, getting similar results. But we started finding at the policy level was a very interesting phenomenon. When you give policymakers at a city or a state or a federal level a new policy instrument, they start thinking very differently about how to do policy. And they started coming up with all kinds of new ways to support this. And it was very exciting. In one country, in particular, the Netherlands, they now created a new category of policy instruments called social instruments, which is basically empowerment. And they began to look at how to build policy around that kind of tool. And in fact, in that country, we hit critical mass, and it actually diffused well into the early majority, and in some parts of the country, the late majority. We literally became a household name in the Netherlands because that country was primed for diffusing of this innovation. We also began to discover that the media became a great outlet for diffusion, and we started diffusing the whole notion of sustainable lifestyles in this country. Started getting a whole conversation going. So those were some of the tipping points. Beyond that, we started discovering there were 4 fundamental social transformations that this thing drove. One was the idea of changing the relationship from city and citizen as adversaries to city and citizen as partners. Huge. If you want to get city employees to engage, city agencies to engage, when they think about citizens, the first reaction is this. Because usually they're beat up for all the things they're not doing right. But when you begin to get a whole new collaboration going, again, the game changes. The second thing we started diffusing was this notion of a sustainable lifestyle, shifting from wasteful use of resources to sustainable use of resources. What is my relationship with my city? I have to sustain the resources. And we began to also find, as part of that, the whole notion of cities subsidizing wasteful use of resources out of taxpayer dollars. And that shift started to happen also. Because think about who actually pays for inefficiencies. It's the cities pay for the inefficiencies of the people who live in that city. And that doesn't have to be that way if citizens become partners. The third thing we looked at was the notion of community, the shift from residential isolation and alienation to livable neighborhoods. One of the programs that grew out of this was the Livable Neighborhood Program in the city of Philadelphia, particularly the inner city. We started applying the same methodology to addressing health, crime, drugs, and all kinds of issues. Same basic process. And I might add, in that program, when you had that issue, we were getting a 61% recruitment rate. 6 out of every 10 people on the block participated. That was pretty exciting also. And I'll say something a little later on about our work in New York City, working in multifamily dwellings post 9/11, but I won't get to that quite yet. And the last thing was citizenship, the shift from entitlement and critic to empowered participant in social change. Climate change comes along. One of the cities that we worked with, Portland, Oregon, in 2000, said, you know what? We get that this thing works. Our struggle is climate change. We're trying to get a 10% reduction per household. Would you be willing to take this methodology and apply it to the issue of climate change? No one had ever done anything like that before. Up till now, climate change was about energy efficiency, and the climate change impact came out of that. This would be a direct assault on taking on that issue explicitly. We said we would love to have that opportunity. And what we began to find as we started exploring that was that the residential sector represents between 50 and 90% of a community's footprint. And if there's not a lot of industry, it's very close to 90%. This is where the low-hanging fruit is, and this is where a city has to engage. And by the way, at the national level, it's half of America's footprint is the residential sector. This is the opportunity, without any doubt, if we're going to tackle climate change, if we can scale up behavior change community-wide and nationally. So we took on this idea, we created this program we called the Low Carbon Diet, a 30-day program to lose 5,000 pounds. People loved how fun it was. And we tried it out, and we got a 22% carbon footprint reduction. We got 6,700 pounds per household reduced. And interestingly enough, we got a 43% participation rate. People had pent-up demand to tackle this issue. Given a tool, given the support system, they engaged. But it wasn't the right time. Al Gore had not come out with his movie. The world had not awakened. We were still kind of in slumber around this issue. But I knew at the right time, this could be a tool that could be helpful. So that time came with an inconvenient truth, and I wrote another iteration of the book, and we set out to see if we could tackle climate change one household and neighborhood at a time and scale that up. So our program was to help individuals reduce their carbon footprint, then help them translate that to the workplace, to do the same, and to the community. Created 24 actions, broke it into 3 topic areas: lifestyle practices, household systems, and helping others lose unwanted pounds, empowering others, if you will. Lifestyle practices are things like turning off the lights. Household systems are, the furnace system that you might use, or your car. We created a calculator to help people get a baseline to calculate their footprint. They chose actions to reduce it by 5,000 pounds or more or become carbon neutral. One of the things we also did was we created a rating system between 1 and 10 to find out where you fit on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being 85,000 pounds or more, and 10 being carbon neutral. And so people who were doing good stuff already could already find themselves on this scale in relation to one another. Most Americans are at 55,000 pounds or more.